The Swan's Inn public hearing number 4, so we're down to public hearing number 5, a countywide ordinance amendment. Ms. Hunter, I see you're already in place. Good.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. This is the ordinance amendment to change the provision for home occupation to delete rental of rooms to tourists. The purpose of the ordinance amendment would be to delete this provision. It says rental of rooms to tourists, which would apply to short-term rentals of 30 days or less. This amendment would require all short-term rentals in the county to be considered a bed and breakfast use, which would require a CUP. So what are short-term rentals? These are typically called Airbnbs after one of the booking sites, but it's part of the sharing economy where a homeowner can rent a room or an entire home for terms for fewer than 30 days. So previously, anything that has rented the entire home has been clearly identified as a short-term rental bed and breakfast and requires a conditional use permit. The ones where it gets a little more unclear is when it's renting a single room out while they're still living in the home. The home occupation ordinance requires you, it says, if you live in the home, you can have this as a secondary use and you can rent out a room in your home for transient rentals. This provision would take that out, so all short-term rentals would require a CUP in the county, whether it's renting out one room or renting out your entire home. So that is the purpose of this ordinance amendment. Again, so the county regulates these uses as a bed and breakfast use. Bed and breakfast use is defined as a use composed of transient lodging provided within a single-family dwelling and or structures that are accessory to the single-family dwelling, which may include meals if accessory to the bed and breakfast use. So these uses would require a CUP in the A1 and A2 districts. Now the home occupation is available more widespread in all the zoning districts, and this provision right now, you can rent rooms to tourists if you live in the home, and this is a secondary use to you living in the home. This provision would remove the rental of rooms to tourists under the home occupation provision, which would require any short-term rentals in the county to require a conditional use permit. This is sort of a stopgap measure when we do the zoning rewrite, which we're going to be hitting hard in 2018. We are going to look at short-term rentals in a more comprehensive manner, but this would be sort of temporary to just kind of get everybody on the same level playing field, regardless of whether you rent out your entire house or just a room in your house. All short-term rentals would require a CUP, and we'll look at it more comprehensively through the zoning rewrite. But I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have.
Any questions from Ms. Hunter? Clarification?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
So, Ms. Hunter, would you go back on the zoning, the A1, A2? Okay.
This one?
That one, yes. Okay. So, if this is adopted, then transient short-term defined 30 days or less, whether it's one room or the entire house, has to have a CUP everywhere in the county.
Right now, it would just, it's specifically listed in the A1 and the A2 districts. As part of the rewrite, we would look at what other zoning districts it would be appropriate in, whether we want to consider it in all of our residential districts or not.
So it would be a CUP in an A1 or an A2. What about the other zoning districts?
Right now, the bed and breakfast use is not permitted in the R1 or the R3 or the RPUD districts. So we would be saying right now, none in those districts, but we would look at this more comprehensively with the zoning rewrite and actually try to develop some standards.
Okay, so CUP in A1 and A2 and not allowed anywhere else at this point?
At this point.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, so for clarification, so it's not allowed in RR either?
I have to double check on the RR. It may be in the RR. Let's check in the code, or it's conditional use in RR. Okay. So the rural residential districts, it is. Okay. Thank you.
And again, just to clarify, currently if you, on a short-term basis, rent out the entire house, that's permitted?
That's a CUP as
That's
a
a
bed and
CUP.
breakfast.
As a bed and breakfast. So the
Yes.
entire house, if you do it now, it's
Mhm.
currently a CUP bed and breakfast.
Right.
But currently, if you just do a room, it's a home occupation,
It falls under that, yes.
and this would standardize both a room or the whole house.
Yes.
Either one is a CUP in the A1, A2, NRR,
Mhm.
and then not allowed in the others, which is currently not allowed in the others as well.
Right.
Does that clear things up, or is that muddy thing? But thank you for that, that helps me,
Okay.
so,
Mr. Chairman,
yes, sir.
you're saying we're just doing this for, as a temporary stopgap measure for, how temporary is it? I mean, is it?
As part of the zoning rewrite, which, has been on our plate, we've had some other things that have come along that have put a stop to that, but 2018, we will be back to that. We hope to have the zoning rewrite done in the next 18 months. As part of the zoning rewrite, what we're doing is taking a look at a lot of our uses and not requiring CUPs for everything, but allowing things with, by right with development standards. So we would look more comprehensively at what zoning districts these type of uses are appropriate in. Would it be appropriate in an RPUD? Would it be appropriate in R1 district, looking at lot sizes? And if it was, maybe perhaps doing something with, allowing it in if someone lives in the home, they could rent out a room with certain development standards. But we're just not there yet with getting all the information of where we want to go with
Are we
this.
having a problem?
We have had, we have one that is, everyone that has come before the county has been controversial, and citizens who live next door have had significant concerns about the Airbnb. County, not only in the county, but nationwide, there has been concerns with the Airbnb process. People are concerned with the commercializations of their neighborhood, people not following rules because they don't live there, noise, parties, that sort of thing. So nationwide, there has been problems with the Airbnb type of development, and everyone that has come before the county has been controversial.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, one more thing. This is only for short-term rentals.
Yes.
So a homeowner could rent a room to a student or family member, whatever.
Right, we would not want to restrict that anyway. If somebody wanted to have a roommate or anything like that, that would absolutely be allowed. This is just for a 30-day or less, transient type.
So a 6-month or a 1-year lease for a house,
That's absolutely fine.
Other thoughts, clarifications from the center at this point? All right, seeing none, thank you. Since the county is the applicant, there's no applicant time, but we will go ahead and open a public hearing. So anyone who would like to come forward and speak on this public hearing, now's the time to do so. And as you come forward, I'll just remind you to please give us your name and address for the record, and limit your comments to about 3 minutes.
My name is Ronnie Kitt. I live 1541 Newtown Road. I do have a rental home in Goshen, and this does concerns me somewhat. Sometime in between getting permanent renters, you may need to rent your home for maybe a few days, maybe a month or so. And when I'm listening to this, I really don't know what the problem is in Goshen County. I hear you say a lot about the nation, but we're in rural county in Goshen, and I don't see a big problem with 30-day rental. Maybe you have had people that come and complain, but me being a renter, I do try to make sure I have people in there that respect the neighbors and respect the county. So I really feel a little sore about this and what is going forth, and hope for this will not pass, and that's just my stance on it. I'm give you my input on it. I would like to see us keep it that we can still do a short-time rental or lease.
Okay, great, thank you, thank you.
Jonathan Lyle, 1521 Mannequin Road. I have mixed emotions on this, or a little bit of an internal conflict, because the shared economy is a reality, and it's with us, and it's going to be with us, and it makes sense. I also have concerns about restricting property rights and homeowner rights. But the reality is there are folks who have taken on the short-term rental and in essence taken residential properties and turned them into hotels without any licensing or any of the what I'll call level playing field requirements out there. So if there were a way, and I don't know that there is tonight, to allow somebody who, and I'll use Richmond Raceway twice a year, the NASCAR races are here in the county, and I know that there are people who will rent out rooms during race weekend just to accommodate, because hotel rooms are at a premium. They aren't available. And I would not want to see that restricted, but at the same time, how do you not restrict the abusers of people who are not living in the houses, in essence have turned them into hotels and are renting them out, maybe not with the frequency here in Goochland County, but it is a Gordian knot. If you don't have somebody complying with the short-term rental ordinance as it is now, they're not in the house, but they're renting it out. And gosh knows, it's party weekend for, college kids to pick on a cohort there. But the shared economy's here. It makes sense. I like the idea that somebody can rent out a room and make a couple bucks, but it has become a scenario where people are not doing what this picture book imagery is that, oh yeah, we got somebody coming in for the race weekend, or in some rural areas, we got bluegrass festivals down in Galax, Old Fiddlers Convention. It's become a scenario where people are abusing it. So something needs to be done. I don't know if you can self-police it, where if they are renting, the homeowner is renting out more than 30 days in a calendar year. So you may have somebody there for a weekend, and then 3 months later, somebody else there for a weekend, and maybe 4 months later, somebody else for a weekend. But once you hit that 30-day, you really have stopped becoming just an occasional pick up a couple of bucks to help, pay the electric bill, and you become a commercial entity. And I'm not sure how the county can police, its almost honor system. I'm going to have people in here for more than 30 days, and now I'm going to go get a bed and breakfast license. And that's the problem, is that if you don't require everybody to do it, then you got people doing it and never reporting the tax revenue, and the people complying, the bed and breakfast. We got 2 in the county who do comply with the current ordinance. Guys, it's a tough one. I hate to see it restricted, but at the same time, it is being abused. There are people renting out properties that aren't resident, and good luck on this. I would probably, man, I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth, would approve the change to the ordinance. Here and in the back, as Mr. Creasy observed, it's a short-term fix, but man, telling somebody what they can or can't do with their property, but at the same time, realizing their people are saying, I'm going to run myself a hotel, and I'm not going to pay licensing taxes or occupancy tax or any of those other type of things. It's a tough one. Good luck, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. How do I score that one? Thank you. Again, just name and address, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellen Pons, and I own property on Shepherdtown Road, and I actually run an Airbnb. So, and it's very successful because the county is a beautiful place. I expect my house to be treated as well as I would treat it, or better. I monitor the people that come to book through Airbnb and those kind of sites, and I've had no issues. I'm not sure. I certainly know that there are issues where things can go wrong. I think that you can handle those on a nuisance complaint basis. I think this is needs to be looked at in the zoning, because yeah, you need to have control of things. I do contribute. The people, I had the house rented out for, and by the way, this is a 3rd generation property that I inherited and then bought from my brothers and sisters after my great uncle had it Jim Ball started Elk Hill with Buford Scott, and it's 115 acres, and thank God Airbnb came along because I can now pay my mortgage, and the house is benefiting. The restaurants in the area are benefiting. Tanglewood, the restaurants up and down 250. But anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think it's good to look at it in the zoning thing. I think that the conditional use permit is good, and I think it's a tourist boom for bringing people that are like-minded about your community. So, you know, the people that want to raise hell and go to the hotels and be down in Short Pump, and so I'm with this fellow over here that says, you know, you got to look at it both ways. But I think there's a lot of good to not keep finding ways to coordinate it with the community. So, thanks.
Good, thank you very much. Anyone else like to come forward? Nope, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
if it's gonna be temporary and all that, and they did, what would it be, at least $700 go through a CUP process, right? If it's only gonna be temporary, I don't know whether it's in even our best interest or the citizens to go through that process until we know what we're doing.
Okay. Other thoughts,
Yeah,
Savage?
I'm conflicted because I have had a lot of complaints, because there have been a few in my district that have had issues. But I totally get it. I believe people should be able to do what they need to do with their property and their home. I think just doing some research before tonight, other localities have come up with some policies that make sense. They include some licensing, some evaluation by maybe the health department to make sure that the home meets all the safety requirements and whatever. And there's some kind of recording, and they pay the short-term rental tax. So I think that there's ways of fixing it, and perhaps, and maybe this is where Mr. Creasy was going, is while I was all for going ahead and getting this done, maybe we ought to try to move the short-term rental change up sooner in our rezoning versus putting something in place that's going to force some people to get a CUP, and then a few months down the road, it's no longer required, or they'll have to follow some different procedure that we implement. I think the concern is valid, and you can, some of the information I found was Charlottesville, Albemarle County, the city is looking at this right now, and even a place like New Orleans, where you would think anybody could lease a home and not have a problem, there have been major issues in New Orleans where entire blocks have decided we're going to rent our homes, and all of a sudden it becomes party blocks. I know it's a little different out here, and I almost see Mr. Kitt's problem a little different, because he's got a home that he rents out, not through Airbnb. I'm sure he would love to have it rented year-round. Once in a while, a person moves out, and he's got somebody that can move in for 30 days. I almost see that differently, because he knows who it is. It's not some other Airbnb or some other company making that determination and decision. And so I almost see a difference there, but anyway, I'm not sure if I see Joanne kind of wanting to say something maybe.
If I could just add a
Mr. Badesky,
piece to
sure.
that. Joanne, I think we're probably 12 to 18 months away from really bringing something back that would address this more long-term. And I think, and certainly this was a stopgap, we admitted that as we started this. In that interim period of time, if you get a complaint from a resident that they don't like what's going on in their neighbor's home in these particular districts, we have no mechanism to address it. This was that mechanism. And that's certainly fine if that's the board's prerogative. This was a way to try to address it, and again, these were still allowed through a CUP. Mr. Creasy makes a fine point that's a time and cost that has to be incurred. We would have limitations in any ability to enforce any regulation in that interim period of time. This was also an issue your Commissioner of Revenue brought up to you about business licenses and our ability to track and enforce that issue. And again, could this wait 12 to 18 months? Those are just the risks you take, that we wouldn't have any mechanisms to address those particular issues in that period of time until we came up with something more long-term.
Thank you.
So,
Bartlett?
so, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with Mr. Alvarez. I'm really torn on some of this. I've also received a lot of complaints, and it's always the way. You know, it's one person or a couple of people kind of spoil it for everyone else. I've got a couple of comments. One is we're talking about short-term rentals of 30 days or less. Could it be less than 30 days, and would that solve your problem in renting 30 days at a time, is one question that I have. And the other is, what happens to if we were not to approve this, we have people who have applied for business licenses, people are in the CUP process, they're paying their taxes. What happens to them if we say we're not gonna do this? So now we've got an inequity, I think. So it's kind of a problem. Having this gap, I think it causes us more problems than not. That's what I'm concerned about, because we've already got people in the pipeline to kind of comply, and then if we don't do it, what happens then?
Mr. Chairman, do we know how many's involved? Does anybody have an idea?
It's only a handful.
Yeah, we reviewed the list. I believe there was 7 or 8 in the county. There was only one that was on the list that just rents out one room in the house. All the other ones were full house rentals, so there's only one that would be considered non-conforming, and they could continue even if this was approved, because they've already gotten all their permits for that. So it would be an existing non-conforming use. But typically, what we are seeing for the ones in Goochland, the people that do the short-term rental, it's the whole house rental.
So you mentioned the one that's currently operating would be a non-conforming use, would be grandfathered, if you will.
Yes.
Yes.
How about the folks that are in the pipeline? Do we have folks in the pipeline applying for CUPs as well?
We do have a CUP coming actually before the Planning Commission tomorrow evening for a bed and breakfast for the whole house.
So, I mean, presumably this could have an effective date for applications received by the county after a certain date. Does that begin to
Yeah.
address that issue, or?
I don't know, that's my
Yeah.
question.
I mean, is that, so that folks that are either already approved
Right.
or in the pipeline
So
or
the one that's
existing?
in the pipeline, if this was to not move forward this evening, they could change it and say, well, we're gonna stay in the house, and they could have their bed and breakfast. And that has had some opposition and some concerns from the neighbors.
Okay, so they're going in front of the Planning Commission, but tomorrow night, I think it is, right?
Tomorrow night, yes.
In order to comply with this, on the assumption that this is approved. Okay, so changing the date of the effective date doesn't impact them at all. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, did you say that they would go back to being a bed and breakfast?
What do you mean?
If the one coming before you,
Yeah.
if this was not approved this evening, they could perhaps change their mind and say, well, we're not gonna leave the house, we're gonna stay in the house, and it's just gonna be a home occupation and not a bed and breakfast. So I think and then how does the county enforce whether they're in the house or not when they have renters there? It's very difficult to enforce whether a homeowner is staying in the house or not. So from an enforcement perspective, we would prefer to see all of these treated the same way.
Whether you live in the house or not.
Yes.
Now, is there any possible way with this situation like we have here tonight for these two citizens that they could be grandfathered?
We'd have to see if they have existing, or they business license and things like that. We could look into it. I know we had the Shepherdtown, there was a property on Shepherdtown Road on our list. We had it as a hold house rental. We might have had wrong information.
That it was what?
We had gotten information that there was one on Shepherdtown Road. I don't know if it's Miss Pond's property or not, that they were renting a whole house. Again, these are difficult to find. We also don't know if we have all of them. I may have a different one on Shepherdtown Road than her property. I couldn't say for sure.
Is there any problem asking her?
Well, I think where you're going with this is, are the two folks that spoke tonight, are they existing non-conforming that would be grandfathered or not? Is that kind of the question?
Or people similar to our situation?
And it sounds like at
They're
least
saying no.
they may be
If-
whole house, so they're not existing non-conforming. Is that,
Correct, they would not be, They would not be affected by this particular ordinance amendment, because this only deals with home occupation, so it's an accessory use. So you have to live in the house and then rent out rooms just to tourists, not a roommate, in order for you to have been grandfathered under
Okay.
this particular ordinance change.
okay, and it
So
sounded, go ahead.
The situation they described, or would they be grandfathered or not?
No.
That would have to be evaluated. It's a whole house. It's a whole house rental, so it's a different situation than this. So I would recommend that
Yeah.
you get with planning staff and they can help you work through
So
that. So that's a different
Yeah.
situation, rather than living in the house and renting out one or two rooms to transient renters. Their
this-
situation isn't covered by this ordinance.
That's, yeah.
And what
They're
about
not
the
impacted by
lady
that one.
back there?
So your whole house as well? Okay.
Yeah, so those would already require, those would already be considered a bed and breakfast. That would not be impacted by this
So
ordinance.
neither of the folks that
So
spoke
neither-
tonight.
So it sounds like you wouldn't be affected. Okay.
Other questions? Yes.
I still do have, I can definitely see a difference in renting a home for 30 days as opposed to tourist or transient rental. Do we make a distinction, or can we make a, because I definitely can see a difference there.
Transient rental is typically 30 days or less. I don't believe that, I'm not sure if that is defined anywhere in our zoning ordinance. I believe that's just sort of a national standard of how you define transient. Anything longer than 30 days is considered a more permanent situation. Most of the Airbnbs and all are typically a weekend or a week,
Exactly.
not
That's
30
my
days.
point. I think there's a difference.
I think, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead.
to Ms. Hunter's point, we are trying, it is more of a national standard and standard that's being used consistently in the region to define what is a longer-term rental. And so from a benchmarking standpoint, we're just trying to, that's where that language came from for consistency's sake. I do appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to the concern. I think there was some good clarification that was just made a little bit ago about what this ordinance is and what it isn't. This does not typically affect rental, and they would be covered under a separate ordinance. This is just for those in addition to you in an additional room that you're not occupying as the homeowner, that you're choosing to rent out for transient occupants. This is not your second home that you're renting out for shorter periods of time or longer.
This isn't an investment property that you bought to rent out. This is, you're living in the home and you're offering it a room for, 2 weeks or a weekend or something along those lines.
So that, this does apply to that or not?
This would only apply, this particular ordinance would only apply to if you are renting in your own home. You have to live there, you have to stay there during the rental process. But again, from a staff perspective, determining whether someone is staying there during the rental process or not would be next to impossible for us to enforce.
Does that clear things up?
Not at all.
Clear as mud?
No.
Also with this ordinance, it's kind of one of these things do not belong. If you look at the other home occupations, they're activities, commercial activities that people are actually doing. You're providing legal services or dental services, you're making something to give somewhere else. This is more passive. You have a room and you're letting it out. I don't know that I would call that an occupation anyway. It's more like a use, like a bed and breakfast type use than an occupation.
It's actually almost conflicts with our bed and breakfast definition, because our bed and breakfast definition talks about that it could be in the home or accessory to the home. That's why we're doing the complete zoning rewrite, because there's so many places in our zoning ordinance where things conflict with each other. This is, again, just another example of that. So we thought we had addressed it through bed and breakfast, and then, oh, here we find this, and again, we find that a lot in our code. And that's what we're trying to make everybody on the level playing field, everybody treated the same way who are doing these short-term rentals, regardless of whether you stay in the home or not stay in the home. We would want it to be consistent.
Go ahead.
Could I
Wanna
try
take it a
one more
shot?
time?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so we're talking 30 days or less.
Yes, ma'am.
You're renting only or leasing, I guess renting only a room in your home. So that is a CUP, not a CUP, okay?
Today,
Not today, it's not. You can rent a tourist short-term in your house today.
Okay, so if we adopt this,
Yes.
then it's a CUP in A1, A2, and RR. So adopt, okay, A1, A2, and RR, and
RP also. RP, so all our rural residential districts.
and no everywhere else. If you're renting your whole house, and we adopt this, what do you have to do then?
It has nothing to do with adopting this. Renting your whole house as a short-term rental, Airbnb, requires a CUP
already.
already.
Already today.
Yes,
That would be unchanged.
no change to that. So we would be now saying all short-term, if this was approved, we would be saying all short-term rentals are treated the same. You have to have a CUP, and you can have them in our rural residential districts with the CUP.
But we're excluding other residential districts, even with a CUP.
As of right now, yes. And like we
Nope.
said, as we go through the rewrite, we may look and see some of those other smaller lot residential districts if this use is appropriate, but we have not determined that at this time. So this is really only impacting A1 and A2s.
Well, no, it's impacting everybody else.
Yeah.
That can't do it anymore, right?
No, they never could.
Can't do it now.
Can't do it now.
They can't do it now.
Can't do it now. So, as I understand it, we're talking about rental of your primary residence. If you rent it and occupy it, currently you don't need a CUP. If you rent it and don't occupy it, you need a CUP. So the incentive is to rent it, say you're gonna occupy it, and you either do or you don't. And there's really no way to police that. If we pass this, whether you rent it and occupy it or rent it and don't occupy it, you're treated the same way either way. So it takes off the table the are you living there or not issue. Is that?
And it would also give us the opportunity to have public input. You might have, shared public-private drives, you may have noise complaints. We cannot police noise complaints. We do not have a noise ordinance. The type of nuisances that occur with this type of use, we do not have the tools in place to address, such as a noise ordinance or things like that.
So they'd all be treated as a bed and breakfast, whether you're occupying it or not.
That's the goal of this ordinance, yes.
Does that do any better for you? No. Oops, it was a shot.
Better than I did, so.
While she's continuing to think on this, ruminate on this, this is a developing edge. I mean, this is a developing area. As we've heard, the shared economy is a developing economy. Others are certainly wrestling with the same issues we are.
Absolutely.
How closely are we following out our peripheral vision, what other people are doing to try and wrestle with the same issue and balance the desire to protect property rights and balance that with protecting neighboring property rights and try and strike that balance where we can encourage, economic activity, but have it be done in a safe manner, so there's no public safety issues, have it be done where you're not trampling on other people's property rights that may share a driveway with you, et cetera.
Right.
How closely are we looking at others to say, are they doing what we're doing, everything's a bed and breakfast, or are they?
Everybody is struggling with this now. I know the city of Richmond, Hanover, Henrico, they're all in the process of either redoing their ordinances or looking at them. People are either allowing them by right with development standards or requiring some sort of public hearing permit, either it be a public CUP process or some sort of special exception. More people than not are opposed to it when it's coming into their neighborhood, and most localities in the country are dealing with people complaining about the Airbnbs. So people have started them without getting any sort of approvals, and then you get the neighborhood complaints, and then you're trying to catch up and address the complaints. So it has been controversial in many localities. But I do think most people are requiring some sort of permit process.
And so this isn't necessarily out of line with what other folks are trying to wrestle with as
No.
well? Okay. And for those that may be thinking about starting, I guess we do monitor Airbnb to see who in Goosen might be offering up.
Yes.
Okay.
The Commissioner of Revenue and the Zoning Office spent a significant amount of time going through the different platforms to find out where rentals were in Goochland, making sure that they have business licenses. There's also public safety issues. If there are over 10 people staying in it, it's considered a hotel, and they have to have different requirements. It's also important for our public safety officials to know that, these places are being rented so that they may know what they're getting into if there's some sort of emergency situation, that there may be, 8 or 9 people and not just 2 people in the residence. So I think the permanent process is good for everybody in the county to be aware of where they're located. It also gives the public, an opportunity to comment and provide their concerns and feedback.
Okay, so it sounds like there's the prudent thing would be to have at least a light touch here. I think we're all a bit leery about having a heavy hand come in, but maybe a light touch is appropriate at some point. So, and we'll continue to monitor that as it develops and bring back to us new ideas that people might come up with that better address the issue without solving a problem that isn't there. So,
I have no problem copying somebody else's work, so yes.
not reinventing. Additional?
Just one other thought.
Okay.
We had looked at, I think, different levels of the cost of a CUP. Is $700 the lowest?
The fee is actually $750. What we did is we reduced the cost for renewals.
Okay.
So all CUPs are $750, except for telecommunication towers, which are significantly higher.
Didn't we change it for agricultural? I thought we had reduced it, or was just a POD process?
It was the POD process we reduced.
I think one of the ordinances that I saw out there that I thought might be a good fit was the one in Albemarle or Charlottesville, I'm not sure which, because I think they both kind of went with the same, where it was an administrative process.
Yes.
And the person kind of comes into the county, says they're gonna do a bed and breakfast or rent out a room for tourists, and there's an inspection required, and there's a requirement that there be somebody available to resolve any issue within 30 minutes or 30 miles, I don't remember which, of the property, so that it puts a little bit of, because I think the biggest problem, the complaints that I've received have been from people that are in the neighborhood. There's been a party and there's no way to contact anybody that can
Right.
address the issue. So now the neighbors are the ones dealing with the issue.
Right.
And I see it differently than a long-term, because most anybody that comes to rent a home is either temporarily looking, I've done it before when my house wasn't finished and I needed to
Yeah.
rent for 60 days. Or they're coming into the community waiting for a home to be finished or close on a house or whatever. Tourists is a little different. In most cases, you're here to party. You're on vacation, and I think that's the problem that we see is they come, they have a party in mind, and they don't pay attention to what the neighbors are, or where the limits are. We've heard of one where they're using the neighbor's pool. And that's the kind of thing, and we have no authority to regulate it, other than catch them in the act and charge them with trespassing. So, but I do have, there's a certain part of me that it even concerns me that we have gone out to look to see who's doing this. Just kind of, makes me a little uncomfortable. So I'm just not sure. I thought this was gonna be kind of easy, because we already have the regulation for the bed and breakfast.
Right.
But you start throwing in other short-term rentals, and where's the line? Is the word tourist? If you're not renting to a tourist, does that make it a different kind of rental?
If this ordinance were to come before us today, we wouldn't recommend the word tourists because it's not defined and is difficult. So there are enforcement issues with the terminology that's in there, even if it were to remain.
I think we ought to tread lightly.
Yeah,
Okay, we defer it.
maybe we should defer.
We're pretty good at that.
I don't know.
I hear Mr. Badesky and staff saying that if you want to do a comprehensive rewrite, that's going to be out too far in the future, and there'll be no way to address issues that come up.
Right.
But the other question is this ready for prime time as is? Given some of the concerns we've heard and given some of the, potential solutions or considerations, is there a way to make at least some of it administrative in nature, as long as it's not a shared drive, as long as you're 500 feet away from is there a way to kind of make this faster, easier, cheaper, and simpler, where it's an obvious, there's no issues here, why are we going through the CUP, why are we paying the money? Kind of like a low impact, high impact that we have
Exactly.
now.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Could we not move it up quicker on the schedule instead of 18 months? Look at it sooner. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, we can certainly look at it in the work plan. There's a trade-off. As we
Yeah, I
move
know
this
it
ordinance
is.
up, something else is gonna get pushed. And so we're certainly willing to do that for you.
I don't know. What I understand, it won't affect these people and people in like situations. My main concern was, cause somebody have to go out and spend $750 and, 6 months from now, they might not need it, to done it. Or might have to do something over. I don't know.
We have one in the pipeline for tomorrow night.
Hmm?
We have one in the pipeline for tomorrow night, I guess, that's going through that process as we speak.
Can I just be clear, the one tomorrow night is actually not under the home, not the home
No.
occupation that this is, and
It's
I
a
think we're
whole
still
house. Oh, okay.
crossing these a little
It's a
bit.
more-
It's still a
it's a
whole
B&B?
house. It
Okay.
falls under other ordinance.
Okay.
That would still have to move forward in that process.
Okay, okay, regardless of what we do tonight on this.
Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering if it would be possible not to defer for 12 to 18 months, because I don't think that makes sense either, but just another 30 or 60 days and see if we can tighten this up just a little bit, work on this some.
Yeah, given our lumpy workload here, you're probably talking about the May at the earliest, right? Is that?
That's what I'm
Get
thinking.
past the budget and the deferred cases already. You look at May as the
If
earliest.
the board was comfortable, at least May would be more reasonable. Joanne, I'm gonna,
Yeah, we could bring something back in May. We probably would need a little bit more direction on what you're looking for, so maybe we can schedule it for a 2x2 discussion or something like
Yes.
that.
Does that make sense?
That's what I'm thinking.
Make sense? 'Cause we tend to, not try and circle back and redo things, if we can just get it
I
done right
know.
the first time. And you've probably sensed right now that there's a lot of mixed feelings up here, and there's a lot of mixed feelings among the citizens about what the right approach is here. So perhaps with a little more consideration and a little more discussion, we can maybe perhaps come up with something that's more on target with what the needs are, and use more of a scalpel than a chainsaw approach. So, okay. Board, yeah, I guess let's see, we've opened the public hearing, we've closed the public hearing, we've had our discussion. I guess at this point, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we defer this ordinance change to be reviewed by staff and to be brought back to the board at the earliest, at the May meeting,
May 1st.
Second.
May 1st.
That's it.
And we have a second for May
Yeah.
1st.
May 1st, second?
First, second?
May 1st, second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. If there's no additional discussion, Mr. Badesky, I'll ask for a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Creasy.
Yes.
Mr. Alvarez.
Yes.
Mr. Minnick.
Yes.
Ms. Lachelette.
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
May I add something really quickly? If we significantly change this, just so you know, it has to go through the planning commission again. So I just wanted to
Okay.
let you know that it has to go through the whole public hearing process again.
Okay,
As long as we get it right.
As long as we get it right.
as long as we get it right, whatever it takes.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the audience's indulgence on that discussion and thank the board for having that thoughtful discussion so we try and get this right.
Thanks for you.
So thank to the citizens for their input as well, because it was very helpful. So thanks for coming out tonight. Okay, that brings us to our sixth and final public hearing for this evening. It's a public hearing on the proposed FY 2019 through 2043 capital improvement program. Mr. Badesky, would you like to walk us through?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to present to you what is very uncommon in our industry of doing a 25-year capital improvement plan. You're going to hear tonight about a lot of projects. I do have to say I'm very grateful to Dr. Raley and Debbie White here this evening from the schools and a number of the county department heads. There's been a substantial amount of work gone into this product that we share with you here this evening. We're asking for your consideration on adoption of this. If the board's not comfortable this evening adopting, we'd look for no later than the next meeting. I'm going to move relatively quickly through a lot of slides. This board had a separate work session. We have actually had two separate work sessions. We had a joint one with our school board back in November, and in December we had a additional work session to review the 25-year capital improvement plan. For those viewing at home, and even those here in attendance with us this evening, this document in its entirety is available on our website. Those in the room, there is actually a large spreadsheet that we'd encourage you to take a look at as we go through this particular document here this evening. Just talked about the meetings we went through, and just so you know, this process is an ongoing process. We will continue to review this, not only in this public hearing and eventual adoption, but annually relook at this in our April meeting, and then every year this document will be reviewed again. And so this is a living document for us. When we look at this, we look at, just as we do an annual budget adoption, we always look at what are we looking to fund in the next year. This plan includes a 5-year balanced plan, and that's a balanced plan based on our existing ability to pay. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more here in the plan, as well as a 24-year plan. So we talk about the budget year and a total of 24-year plans. The 5 years is balanced. When we looked at projects throughout our collective county and school systems, we look at life systems of facilities. And so some of the stuff here is more, I always call it sexy to talk about new buildings and new projects, but some of this is really making sure that we're investing in our current infrastructure to support our long-term needs over the next 25 years. But we also had to be realistic and recognize the cost differentials that we're going to see over the next 25 years, so we did look at consumer price index impacts. We also had to look at growth impacts on population and the facility needs for both us and the schools. We, on average, is a 2% growth rate. You'll notice in the schools projections, they used a different kind of growth rate that ultimately fed into this. And we all looked at alternatives to maintaining existing structures. And in this case, we looked at how can we reuse vacated space and when do we need to actually construct new space to meet our needs. This particular plan is constrained. And what I mean by that is we actually had to look at what is the available debt capacity we have without tax increases. And so we're looking at existing revenues that are available to us. You'll see later in the plan how we actually did the balancing. In prior capital improvement plans, and while we've always done a 5-year, 25 is quite unheard of, we didn't always balance the 5. We looked within our debt capacity, which is how much do we have the ability to borrow. That didn't necessarily make an obligation to doing the borrowing, because that's always in subsequent years. And current boards cannot obligate future boards. In fact, you can't necessarily obligate yourselves to what you're going to do next year. You're really looking at this within the certain constraints that you have. And ultimately, when we start looking at large debt obligations of the county, most likely we're going to do that through general obligation bonds and borrowings. And we would go to our citizens through referendum for those considerations, even if it was within our current capacities, without raising taxes for additional revenues, we would still go for a referendum if we're going to look for general obligation bonds. And so that's one of the considerations here. And we're going to talk a little bit about projects that we may not have been able to fund within the 5-year balanced and how we may look at addressing those through referendum later. We also, and you heard a little bit in some of your earlier cases about proffer impacts and those kinds of things. We really looked at this more of a capacity question. Is the project providing additional new capacity or expanding capacity based on what's currently available in current facilities? We looked at replacements. Most times, if you're just from a capacity and proffer availability, replacing an existing structure that just aged out or timed out, it does not necessarily qualify for a proffer consideration under that. You're just meeting your ongoing needs. What we really looked at, what is the capacity increase? What percentage of that capacity is new capacity that we wouldn't have had otherwise? There was a lot of projects done on the county side. We specifically did a space study. We really looked at all of our needs. I'm not going to go into everything on this slide, but we did look at our needs through 2047. And so we did try to do long-term projections and identify deficits and space needs. And you can see here we had some substantial current deficits, but that grows over time. We looked at not only the county administrative complex, we looked also at the courthouse complex. We also took into some consideration the use of Central High in our planning. And this, it's important to note that we did take the school's input on their planning process. And you'll see as we look at this, some of our longer term needs are based on schools vacating facilities and them being reused. While they may not be good future schools to meet capacity demands and structural needs, they could be used as office space and those kinds of things, and we've taken that into consideration in some of our planning. I want to give you a little bit of an outline of what you have. Board, you have a book that includes certain documents. The spreadsheet that folks in the room has available to them and the board has in the front of your book, I should point out real quickly that the only major changes that have occurred in any of the information you have in front of you today occurred on the transportation side and occurred in years 5 and beyond, with one exception on a road project. We only listed our contribution of the total project on the roads. Everything else is identical to what was presented to you in the prior plan. Just to call out, the numbers listed in gold were already projects that were considered in some form or fashion in your prior adopted plans. Everything else that's not highlighted in gold would be considered new. This is an example of the facilities management. So that's the 5-year, and we also included the out additional 20. Each project listed on that spreadsheet has a separate detail spreadsheet that's included with it. It identifies the project description, the location, the justification, and tries to do a project identification. I will tell you, some of the sites still, because they are projects to be determined, and we're continuing to evolve this, but we used either the department's main address or the county courthouse address. That does not necessarily mean that location may be there. For instance, we call out future fire stations in District 2. We didn't necessarily assign an address. We may have used this one, but the intent, that project would actually be located in that particular district. We also talked about operating impacts if not approved, the actual schedule when we believe the project would be constructed, designed, those kinds of things. We clarified the year of expenditure in the plan, and lastly, the revenue source and the cost summary. So each sheet, and what you're seeing on the screen is actually a breakdown of a single sheet. So for purposes of public hearing presentation, I'm going to focus just on the 5-year projects. Everything else is listed in here. And I'm doing this at a very high level. I'm not going to get into the detail of each individual project. So as I said earlier, we have what have been traditionally our grounds maintenance vehicle replacement schedules here. There are projects that are life cycle kind of related issues with the sports complex, our current library. You're going to see other library projects throughout this plan. Mostly roofs, HVACs, those kinds of things that you see here. And in improvements to this complex. The only one that's a real new project here that's not life cycle related is that administration complex renovation, and that is to address improvements to this facility that were identified in the space needs plan. The out-year project of the countywide fuel management system, as we took the old Company 6 offline, we lost a fueling station. We're going to need to comprehensively address the countywide fuel management system, and that's a project that would actually support both the county and the schools. Most of the other projects that you see listed here really are improvements to other facilities. The library project actually that you see out in fiscal year 22 is a renovation to our existing library using proper funds, and so those are projects. Not too much new here, a lot of maintenance and those kinds of things, but that's really under the county's facility side. What you're seeing here is really the projections of the 24 through 43. Most of this is long-term maintenance projects. In some of these cases, because they're projected out 25 years, you may actually see 2 roofs in a 25-year plan, and depending on where it landed in the plan. Each of these, as I said, have much more detail in the full project. Judicial administration, this is by far the largest county investment that we have in this entire plan. And this is the identification of the needs for a new circuit court building. We had identified this in the last capital improvement plan that we had adopted. We here again are calling out the additional facility. The first few years are contributions to that project, with the borrowing identified in fiscal year 23. Total project cost here is actually about $25 million total project. So, and you'll see that here, it's a combination of cash and borrowing for that particular project. And so that's our main investment that you're going to see that has borrowing. There's very few other projects that have borrowing on the county side. Fire and rescue happens to be one of the others. In these particular projects, you can see we're looking to systematically replace large-scale vehicles, our fire trucks, our ambulances, those kinds of things. This deliberately plans out the replacement of these projects on a replacement schedule and addresses some of those needs. What I would like to call out here is specifically the capital investment and construction of a new fire station within this 5-year window. It also identifies in funding for the acquisition of properties for a new District 2 station, which would be, in the plan has it in an out year, and a replacement for Company 2 in this particular plan, property acquisition, and that's listed in fiscal year 19. Most of the other projects that you see listed here are very routine kinds of things: replacement of fire hoses, turnout gear, cardiac monitor replacement. These are the kinds of daily use kinds of equipment that are being placed on a cycle. Most of the other items have been identified in here. Our ambulance replacement basically has us on an every other year ambulance replacement cycle. We continue to see needs here. The ladder truck had come up in the work session. This is actually a replacement vehicle for what's in cycle now. We are anticipating in the total construction of the West Creek Station an additional ladder truck is in that cost. And so that, and actually in the out years of the plan, you see us having a replacement of another ladder truck, but they are two completely separate ladder trucks, so I wanted to clarify that. Out years continues those replacement cycles, and you do see more, especially if you look at the end of this list. In your plan, they're spread out over term. You see the addition of a number of additional stations that are not currently in our dossier of response locations that we anticipate as growth continues to meet the need. Demands in our county. We also look at response times and response areas as we have identified these stations as well. Library. This project in the 5-year, you're not looking at a need for an additional library project, but we are in the long-term plan anticipating an Eastern Goochland library in the 2030s time frame based on demand and growth in the county. This would be an additional library to support our regional library system. Parks and Recreation. In this, what you're seeing in the 5-year is projects that we've already considered in prior plans. There are a number of additional projects that are anticipated, including additional county and regional parks throughout the county. Eastern area particularly identifies, and I'm going to move to the next slide, some Eastern End Trail projects, Eastern End Park. Courthouse Greenway project is a connector trail system. These projects have been discussed and identified as needs over time. This is the first time you're seeing the full scale and scope of these projects over the 25-year plan. There are other improvements that are built into this plan over term. Some are improvements to existing parks. Some are, again, new parks that would be actually added to our system. Most of these are beyond the 5-year balance plan. Information systems, we also have to look at what is it that we're doing to support our own information technologies infrastructure. And as you can see here, we have a number of different projects that have been reoccurring and things that we do ongoing that are in the gold. There's actually only a few additional new projects: the document management system project over 2 years, and fiber to the animal control shelter, which we'd already added the conduit as part of the utility infrastructure there. And the last new project here was the permitting software for community development. That would allow us to actually have a much more efficient online permitting system, request system, update for folks that want to know where their permits are, those kinds of processes. So, and then beyond. The Sheriff's Department, most of what they have ongoing operational funds that they invest in many of these areas, but they're also, we look at their vehicle replacement schedule. They replace up to 10 vehicles annually based on the mileage that they put on there. Hard to believe we're already talking about a new public radio system and we just rolled the one out. But as this is a 25-year plan, we had to look at the long-term needs of replacement of even that equipment and large weapons replacement systems. These are all in more of the out years. They were in the The top two there are more in the outgoing years. The vehicle replacement one continues out throughout the life cycle of the plan. Transportation, and I mentioned earlier, this is the largest change from what you had seen in your earlier plan. And when we started going back after this board had met and discussed, we really wanted to look at, and even as we looked at over time and investment, what's a more realistic plan of local cash investment in transportation. We all know that the burden's being shifted to localities much quicker than we would prefer. The only real project that we have in transportation is that Fairgrounds Road Extension project. As you know, we've already approved the intersection improvement. The Fairgrounds Road Extension project actually takes from the stub of the intersection down to Route 6. That project, when you saw it originally, was only half of the 3.9 because that was the county's portion. The total project's 3.9, but we anticipated revenue sharing for the other portion. We just didn't show that in the first version. So it wasn't attempting to be misleading. You had seen this 3.9 earlier. We just showed it a little different. In the out years, we actually changed these projects, and there's several slides on this. I'm not going to get into all the detail. When we went back, we wanted to look at, make sure that we were including projects, and some projects have local shares and state shares, and some anticipate some private investment. We had to clarify all that. We also removed projects that we would anticipate that would be entirely built by the developer. They were removed. We also looked at projects across the zones of the county. So east-west, did we have projects that were identified in the different zones, those kinds of things. So as we went back and had to clean all that up, it did change from your first amount. In fairness, is much more of a realistic consideration in a 25-year period of time. And when I say realistic, we went from $300 million of road projects down to about $200 million of road projects in a 25-year period of time. Over time, is that realistic? If we look back at the past 25 years, did we invest $200,000 or $200 million of local funds? We did not. But the revenue streams and structures are completely changing. We don't, none of us can really predict what our anticipated expenditures are going to be 10 years from now even. But I think what we brought back is a little more realistic than even the first round that we went through. So there's a number of transportation projects that are in there. Education is probably, if you take away the county courthouse project and the fire station, which was debt funded, education's our biggest other capital investments that we make in this entire plan. I did want to just, the schools and a citizen committee that supported them and worked for months did tremendous amount of work to come to the conclusions on the recommendations that the school's needs were. And so I did want to pay respect to what those recommendations were in that process. And we went over these in the joint meeting and then again at ours. But there were phased recommendations of needs for replacements and new facilities throughout their plans. And what you're seeing here was that recommendation that came from that committee. And this is the timeframes that were associated with those recommendations for what the committee thought was best based on their research and information. And I think it's fair to say they were challenged to come up with their recommendations without cost constraints or looking about how to fund it. What were the needs? What were the priorities? And that committee and that body of work was a tremendous effort. This plan does have to constrain it based on the ability to pay. And so you're going to see some changes that had happened in that work. Well, when we met with the school board, we challenged them and said, hey, we appreciate all the work that had gone into it to this point. Well, what we need you to do is go back and help prioritize these. If you were to identify in rank order some of your priorities, help put that into some perspective for us so we could prioritize it within our constraints. The school board did so and provided some recommendations back to us, and what you're seeing here are those recommendations that the school board had taken. They had submitted a separate request of when they thought some of these needs were going to be required. And keep in mind, as things change, if we're not building a new facility, they had certain investments that had to go into current operations and to sustain the current facilities, and we had to take all that into consideration. So we had the request that came out after the school board had met. We met with school staff in that process, and ultimately had to make some adjustments to their request. But I feel the need, and I didn't spend much time on it, but I wanted to make sure that it was included in this presentation that folks could take away. This board, on numerous occasions, had seen the full request that had come from the school. As I said earlier, my job is to have to bring it in within constraints of those limitations that I had for funding. And so we had to go back and make certain assumptions and recommendations. And you'll see, while some of this is, we didn't, and I think it's fair to say we didn't remove anything the school requested from the plan. It's all within the plan. We just had to phase different timing of certain needs. I think it's also fair to say the schools would much prefer some of these projects be moved up into consideration. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here as we move forward. But I think what you'll see clearly here is in the 5-year window, we're planning to make investments with the replacement Goochland Elementary School is a major investment here. You're starting to see some investments at Goochland High School. These were planned investments that we had planned in even the last 4 years. The $3.5 million that you see as Project 330, their third line down, is beginning what was actually about a $16 million investment and recommendation that came to us. In the plan, you'll actually see that's phased out beyond that. I think it's important to note that, as I suggested earlier, when we go to referendum, this is a balanced plan. So we'd want to ask our residents, do you support us making these investments and using our debt service funds that we've had going into debt before? We'll now reinvest it in these new projects. This plan does not anticipate a tax increase. One of the questions you can ask at that time, and you can do a referendum in multi-tiered ways, is residents, if there was an additional tax burden required to do more projects, would you be in favor of such? And those projects would be XYZ and would equate to 1 cent, 2 cent, whatever that number was to pay the debt service. Would you be in favor of that? So there is the potential to actually, at the time of referendum, consider more than what my plan's recommending to you tonight. But because I'm constrained, I had to bring in a balance that wasn't able to do that. There is potential for future opportunity for some of those kinds of projects. In this plan, you also see that we extended out the annual bus replacements. In the beyond years, and I think it's important to continue to show this, you can see that we were looking and recognizing there was additional high school investments that need to be made. It's also important to call out that the schools actually have come in with a change from, and it's a fundamental change from what we had discussed earlier. Basically, Bird was initially being considered as a renovation. Now in this plan, it involves a full replacement project as well as Randolph and out years. So there were some changes made from even the committee and once it got to the school board, and this plan recognizes those as well. The last project I'll just call out here is we did anticipate that there will be a future need for the bus garage improvements, potentially at a new location, and potentially over time would support both the county and schools. We anticipate that out in the 30s. You don't see it on this particular screen. It might be shown here in some of those out years, but those are projects that we'd anticipate and develop with the schools over the years. And so in the plan you can see there, I think it's important, we talked a lot about expenditures. It's a very, it's a committed plan to be able to make true investments to sustain our operations and also fund what we were able to identify as our priorities. But to do that, we need to make sure we had the offsetting revenues. And when we looked at how do we offset those projects, you can see here in each of the years, the first 2 years we actually have funds available due to prudent saving and investment that this board has done that we're actually able to transfer, and some of these are year-end savings, to projects to cash fund the first several years of our plan. We do anticipate that we're going to require some prior year savings in year 3, 4, and 5. And you can see those range in the 3.6 to 3.670, 3,519,000, 3,328,000. That's not inconsistent with what our history has been on annual savings. It requires us to continue to operate efficiently. It requires both ourselves and the schools to make sure that we're operating as efficiently as we can, so we have these year-end savings, and I believe we can make those commitments. But it also does have us borrowing, upwards of $52 million in this overall plan. That is well within our debt policies. It's in this plan here. It's also within our current ability to pay. And so while these are large numbers, I don't want to underestimate it. They're also true commitments to meeting identified needs and ongoing operational expenses. So this is just an explanation of the reserves, just over $10 million of where those reserves for the next few years would come to fund those projects that we've identified in those years. I'm not going to spend much time on utilities. I think it's important for us we have to identify utilities long-term planning in the same way we do everything else. For us, utilities is operated as an enterprise fund. That's a little different than most of the other stuff we just talked about as general government obligations. Utilities operates like a business. Its revenues offset its expenditures. It's not really, we don't operate our utilities as a profit, but we don't operate them as a loss system either. And so we try to make sure that we're setting rates and collecting fees and such that will offset those operations. And in the utility side, we've identified a number of projects that we anticipate through connection fees and is our primary revenue source for these. As connection fees and revenues come in from year to year, we would have to offset a number of these projects. I think it's fair to say most of these projects in here are either projects related to continuing to expand our capacity within the Tuckahoe Creek Service District. The rest are projects that have been identified in a long-term water sewer master plan for the county and are consistent with those recommendations. So this plan tackles a combination of those identified needs. And again, these are not projects that our general tax base would pay for. This is funded out of fees that the users of the system have paid into. While they are also general taxpayers, it's not their property tax or personal property taxes. This is just fees they paid into the system. And so you see that here for the 5 years as well as it carries out into the remainder of the years. I know that's a lot of information to share, and I shared it as quickly as I could. Here tonight, we have the opportunity for the public hearing on it. And certainly if the board's comfortable, you're welcome to take action on it tonight. You have that ability. But we would encourage you no later than the February 6th meeting to take action. I know often this forum is that opportunity for us to get that public feedback amongst others that we've had. Should we not be comfortable with that this evening, certainly we can take time to digest that information and recommendations for potential changes or considerations at your February 6th meeting. And again, in April and every year thereafter, we will update this and continue to make improvements to this plan. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I stand ready for any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. As you mentioned, that is quite a bit of information. It's a little bit like taking a drink of water off a fire hose. You know you're thirsty and you like the water, but sometimes it takes your head off. But thank you. Do we have questions for Mr. Badesky at this point on the CIP? No questions? Okay, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, by the way, and thank you for everybody that put all those numbers in those spreadsheets and put thought to it as well, the thought behind it. So thank you for that. All right. At this point, since the county is the presenter here, there's no applicant to present, so I will go ahead and open up the public hearing. Anyone that would like to come forward and speak to the CIP, capital improvement plan that was just presented, now is a good time. 2, 1. All right, that's a good suggestion.
Jonathan Lau, 1521 Manica Road. I just want to say thanks. This is a lot of work, and I'm not at all apologizing for beating myself. I live in Goochland because I want to, not because I have to. And it's this kind of work, I think, that really does make it a place, again, personalizing it, I want to live because you are looking forward. I've done enough budgeting that I know this is a dynamic document. And also, Mr. Badesky, I want to thank you for responding to DMV's phone call to you because they probably told you I needed an eye chart test, and this one qualifies, at least the printed version. But it's impressive. It's impressive. There's some things in there that I might ask, do we really need those things? But I also understand I'm one of 23,622 residents in the county, so some people may put more emphasis on some of the services here than I might, but thank you guys. And I also appreciate really that it was all done with no tax increase, projected. Now, I do know the time value of money and the consumer price index and all those other type of things. 53 cents today is not going to be the same 53 cents 20 years from now, but yeah, it is impressive. And I didn't even fall asleep, so thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lau. Would anyone else like to come forward? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing. And I would just make a comment real quickly. This is not only impressive in shifting from a 5-year to a 25-year look, it's actually groundbreaking in many respects, one of which, in the private sector, if you want to know the condition of your assets, you look at the depreciated value. And the depreciation expense in any given year is tax deductible, so businesses calculate a depreciation expense on an annual basis. Since local governments are not tax-paying entities, there is no emphasis on calculating a depreciation expense for all the county's assets in any given year. And as a consequence, it becomes a little more difficult to figure out the depreciated value of the county's assets. I'll just use an example, a vehicle. If we purchase a sheriff deputy's vehicle, if it has 5,000 miles on it, that's different than 205,000 miles on it. It's still one vehicle. Take that and superimpose that on all the schools, all the firehouses, all the ambulances, and you start to get an appreciation for what is the depreciated value. Do we still have 100% or 90% left, or are we running on the last 5 or 10%? This is groundbreaking in that it attempts to look through the assets into their depreciated value, calculate the replacement cost, to make sure that we're maintaining our assets and not just living off of them to depreciate them. So that's all I wanted to say on that, is just let people know that this is impressive not only as depth and breadth, but also in its conceptual groundbreaking nature. So thank you very much for that. Board, thoughts, discussion? This is a lot of information. By the way, the board, this is not the first time we're seeing this, but it may be the first time that some citizens are seeing this. We've been through this and down this road several times and are reasonably well versed, but that may or may not be the same for all the citizens in the audience or at home. So it will take some time for this to get out and for folks to understand the details. Thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the depreciation, and I know one of the things that the schools did in their consultant was look at the value of the school and how, that was something that was really important, is that they looked at how much you need to invest in them every year. So I think we've taken a real kind of giant step together to look at what we need to do for the future. I too would like, while I think we've deferred a couple of things tonight, I would prefer, since there's not, it's 10 o'clock, not many people left, to give the citizens some time to come back to us with any. So I wouldn't mind deferring to February, just so that I can hear from folks that might not have seen it yet.
Ms. Greasy, thoughts?
Well, I doubt if very many counties have a budget like this, or a CFP, laying out a 25-year plan. And it's hard to imagine how much time they went into it, and it's very put together extremely well. Clear roadmap to follow.
Good.
I appreciate staff doing the hard work that they did.
Good.
And I can go along with what Manny's saying, give people a chance to contact us if anybody has a question and want to put a little input in it. That's fine with me.
Okay, good, thank you. Down at the C section.
That's right. I would say that we're going to be asked to appropriate the revenues and expenses in April. So there is time between now and April for, more additional comments. We've deferred an awful lot of things. I was originally thinking deferring, but I'm actually thinking about approving it. Remember, this is a plan. We're not spending this money today, and we're not gonna appropriate the money until April, so we've got several months to get input. I would be more willing to go ahead and adopt it tonight.
Okay,
Go either way.
Mr. Minnick?
Yeah, my thought is that we could probably, or my thought would be to approach adopting this evening. Again, I think we've kind of set the marker that this is a living, breathing document that will change annually at least, and we do have this interim period now between January and April, when we go to approve the whole thing. We'll have a town hall, we'll have some other things, so we'll be getting, so I kind of see our approval as a bit of maybe a formality tonight, but it helps, I think, inform some of the things that will be coming to us over the next several months. And I think we still have time to take some feedback. I think this will be, again, informative to our discussions on, proffer policies. I think this is a good tool to use for the citizens to see what we believe are the long-term county requirements out 25 years, and what the impacts of some of these decisions on economic development and residential areas are as they relate to this budget. They're directly attributable. At least you can draw a line to what the prospective requirement may be for county facilities, utilities, fire safety, schools, the whole nine yards. So, yeah, again, I would feel comfortable voting on this.
Okay. Well, Mr. Badesky, if I could just get clarification. This CIP, if it were adopted tonight, would feed into the capital impact model, or proffer policy, if you will, calculations over the next several months. And absent that, in the normal course, we typically would be having this discussion sometime in April, later in the process, when we're reviewing the entire budget, so the CIP and the budget. And even if we approve this tonight, we're still gonna bring these out to the town halls before we adopt them, before we do the appropriation, I should say, before any money is spent. It'll be going out to the citizens for comment, real-time, live, in person, and we would still be able to take those comments and make changes to this plan before the first dollar is appropriated in April. Is that a fair characterization?
That certainly is fair and accurate. We will have, that being said, we're still looking to have this adopted no later than the February meeting, because it will guide and the process, as you say, for the model update. Not only this April, but every April after that, will we have the opportunity to revisit this plan. That will, even though we will still look at the 5-year window as a balance, and that will change every year, we're only looking for the year of appropriation. That's where I was going with that.
Okay.
And so we're certainly fine if the board's comfortable this evening taking action or deferring till February, but if there was, we would not recommend beyond that.
Bless you. Yeah.
After all the discussion, I'm convinced. I think it's fine. It is a working document. We'll have an opportunity in April again. As we go through the budget, we'll share it at the town halls. I'm not sure that anybody is going to actually go and look at this in detail to tell me, no, change this or change that. So I'm good with approving it tonight, and I'll still listen to concerns and bring them back in April or before if we need to, right?
Yes, we don't do any appropriation until April, so none of this money would be spent
Right.
or appropriated.
I agree.
Okay. All right, well, it seems like we have a consensus around that. We've already had the public hearing. If there's no other discussion, I'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we, put it in play as it's written.
The motion is to approve the capital improvement plan as presented. Do we have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and second. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Badesky, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Minnick?
Yes.
Mr. Alvarez?
Yes.
Mr. Creasy?
Yes.
Ms. Lachelet?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes. Okay, you have your approval, you have your CIP, and good luck with the capital impact models.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Barbara Horlacker and her staff for all the efforts on this, so.
No fooling.
And she
Still
also
here at
stayed
10
here with
o'clock.
us, so, thank you.
You can come in late tomorrow.
7 o'clock.
Just before we adjourn here, Chief or Eddie, do we know, is there any dusting of snow out yet, or is it the roads clear? Two inches overnight tonight? Okay, for,
What are the roads like what are the roads like?
well, do we,
It's snowing at my house.
okay, so for those that didn't hear that, it sounds like the snowfall has begun in the western part of the county. I would just ask everyone to travel home safe, maybe just a little bit slower and be a little more careful going home to make sure nobody gets hurt.
Don't forget you get your bread and milk.
That said, if there's no other business to come before this body and without objection, our next regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Supervisors is Tuesday, February 6th, 2018 at 3 p.m. and another meeting to follow at 7 p.m. and those meetings are open to the public. Without objection, we'll call this meeting adjourned.